So I've written today to 2 requests from new patrons, one of whom is Jane, who you met last time, and she gave me lots. So I've tried to get all of her things in. They were Echoes, Silence, Patience and Grace. So I'll tell you a bit afterwards about the sort of research and stuff I had to do to get all of those in. And then Alice, who's just become a patron a few days ago, asked for there to be a romantic element. So she's sort of created the thread, and then all of the things from Jane have created the what around it, if that makes sense. But I've got a little poem which I've just managed to do in my extra time.
Not.
Sort of to do with the ending of the story, and it's an extension of the haiku that I did yesterday for my poem. So I've added more haikus to the haiku to make it a more complete picture. So it's called Peace, the extended version. By the fireside coals, silence falls and all is still. Peace in the darkness. Grass is in the wind, softly whispering secret lore, dancing with the breath. Swallows in the sky, darting, chirping here and there, speaking to the night. Breath in the darkness, whispering in the satin air, gentle nighttime song. Now we'll find the start of my story. So the story is called In Search of Silence.
I better keep the sun out of it. You'll get to read it.
It's alright, Dad, I can see.
No, but if I do that, see what happens?
I get stripes, yes.
Okay.
It's okay.
Right.
Have you ever heard complete silence? Really listening closely and hearing nothing at all? Isn't there always something there when you really listen? The silence has a ticking clock, a distant alarm, or another person's breathing, or the mysterious tinkles and drips and heating and cooling creaks of fridges or chimneys, or the wind, or the brush of your own feet on the ground or your sleeve on your side. Perhaps people who've been to space know what complete silence is like. Here, on Earth, if nothing else is moving or speaking or scratching, you can always at least hear your own breath, sometimes even your own heart or your body doing things inside. Ella thought all of this in the course of 1 minute's supposed silence, in which she was supposed to be writing as much as she could on the topic of folklore. But mostly she was noticing the sound that everyone's pens made on their pages, and the sniffing noises of those with colds or hay fever, and the sound of the fluorescent light bulbs, and a moth trapped in one of them fighting to get out. But how did it get in? Sigh. Folklore is often perceived as holding a kind of nostalgic reality long after it. "All right, pens down, and let's discuss what everyone came up with," called Sheng, their tutor. Ella rolled her eyes. Hooray for on-the-spot responding. Sound had always got to Ella. It wasn't just the alleged silences in life that were full of fascinating, sometimes annoying sounds. She could be listening to a song and suddenly notice a piece of paper tapping out of time as it blew in the wind. Or more often, talking to someone and suddenly be distracted from their words by the way they breathed, or the sound their coat made when they waved their hands about, or something else entirely outside the interaction. Whilst this could sometimes, understandably, cause people to regard Ella as lacking in social grace, she didn't mind it all that much. To her, it was like a gift, a special relationship she had with sound in the world that other people lacked. There were only 2 things that Ella didn't like about being able to hear so much. The first was her seeming inability to experience true silence, which made life feel quite hectic all the time. And the second was Bryn. Bryn was an outrageously cool individual in Ella's archaeology topics. She walked into lectures with the tops of various small musical instruments poking out of the top of her backpack, scruffy in the way of someone who just cared much more about what they'd been seeing on their walk up in the hills than what they were wearing or what anyone might decide about them. When they'd introduced themselves around the table in their first tutorial, Bryn had announced that she was taking the archaeology topics literally so that she could study the history of humans' relationship with sound.
Oh.
She already had a degree in music, naturally. Although, of course, she didn't put it that way. She talked about her work like it was drinking a cup of tea. Lovely to do, but unimportant in the scheme of other people's lives. Normally, when Ella tuned out of conversations with people, and they thought her rude or odd, she didn't mind all that much. Good friends looked deeper, and what other people thought of her wasn't really any of her business, as far as she was concerned. But Bryn, what Bryn thought of her had always been her business. From the first day in Archaeology 1A, when Bryn had walked in with an old wooden recorder-like instrument sticking out the top of her bag, and her nose so intently wedged in a book about the development of the violin that she walked right into Ella's shoulder as she tried to pass. To be fair, Ella had stopped in the middle of the aisle to stare at her, which probably wasn't very good manners either. "Oops," laughed Bryn, patting Ella's shoulder where she'd bumped. "Sorry about that. Very interesting book." She waved the volume, entitled From Rebab to Modern Violin, The Evolution of a Beautiful Sound from a Bow. Ella laughed and waved her hand to say it was no problem. She opened her mouth to exclaim that it was indeed a fascinating subject. But then she heard the guy in the aisle seat just next to them saying something about something being like dancing gerbils, and the click-clomp-dunk of everyone's feet piling into the theatre and the light wooden clattering tinkle of the little string of wooden beads that Bryn had around her neck. And instead of saying anything, Ella let an awkward so-called silence descend, and slowly closed her mouth again. Bryn put her head on the side just slightly, smiled, shrugged, and stepped away. Ella sat down, feeling for the first time disgruntled with herself for what had just occurred. That was an interesting person with a love of sound, and I just did nothing. It did little to help when the introductions began in the tute group immediately afterwards, and Bryn described what it was she was doing. When it came around to Ella's turn, Bryn's description of her work was echoing in her ears, bouncing back and forth inside her skull, and it was hard to bring any words about herself to mind at all. "Sound," she echoed vaguely. I'm Ella." She shook her head. "Sorry, I find it hard to tune things out. Can you stop doing that?" She looked at a guy across the circle from her who was clicking his clicky pen with what must have been a very threatening glare, because he looked rather frightened and tucked it inside the front pocket of his baggy hoodie. This was slightly unfortunate as it was sticking outwards a bit, but Ella thought she'd probably caused him enough anguish already, so she didn't say anything. I'm studying arts with a major in sociology, and this is my minor." She couldn't think of anything more interesting to say, on account of the fact she could hear those beads around Bryn's neck moving again as she tilted her head. Was she somehow interested in Ella's mundane introduction? After the tutorial, Ella decided she ought to explain herself to Bryn and steeled herself to try to ignore the birds on the courtyard pond. She hurried out of the room and looked up and down the path, but somehow, inexplicably, Bryn was nowhere to be seen. So, feeling strange and wound up like elastic around a pencil, Ella headed home. On the way, she stopped at her favourite place. About halfway home by car, there was a beach which Ella had been visiting all her life. A short expanse of dunes sat unchanged by the human activity either side, deep and warm and so full of the blended sounds of waves and wind and brushing dune grasses that little else could be heard except a fluctuating rushing sound. Ella wedged herself between two dunes in a deep sandy valley and closed her eyes. Here was the closest she thought she ever experienced to real silence. When only one sound could be heard, everything was simplified. So, why was it any of her business what Bryn ended up thinking of her? After a few weeks of tutorials, Ella had settled in. In the tutorial room, she'd found her wind in the dunes, in the constant white noise of the projector, an auditory presence that was never absent. If she tuned out during group work, she could refocus on the words of her peers by tuning into the projector and layering the sound of their speech over it in her head. The archaeology tutor never put her in the same group as Bryn, and every time Bryn approached Ella, or vice versa, something seemed to go weirdly, almost impossibly, wrong. Bryn was scared of spiders. Ella found out the hard way when they'd mutually rushed for a book the tutor left out on acoustics in ancient temples. She'd already made rather a fool of herself by saying bluntly when they met at the desk, "I just love sound. I should have said, but I got weird." And Bryn had had the good grace to laugh and say, "It isn't a common obsession, so I can see why you're a bit stumped," and sit beside her to open the book and read together. In a matter of minutes, before they'd even got through the first page, down from the air conditioning vent on an elastic grey web came a large, abseiling black spider of the sort that appears potentially dangerous even to the non-arachnophobic, and presented itself between their heads. Bryn made a noise like, "Oh!" and staggered backwards from the desk over her chair and out into the hallway through the slightly ajar tutorial room door. The door bounced off her back and hit someone else in the hallway who dropped their books, and Ella slammed the precious textbook shut and used it as a spider swat. It felt as though there'd been an earthquake. Bryn left for the library to calm down and perhaps borrow a copy of the book that was not covered in a fine spread of spider. Ella wiped up spider bits and read what she could, with Mr. Clicky Pen feeling chipper at the next table. Ella had discovered that there was a lovely hard concrete tunnel under the library with a delightful echo. After class she set out for this spot, which was full of wonderful resonance and not too many people or doors. She still hadn't been able to discover why the door to the sociology room made such a dreadful noise. Like a very distressed donkey. Every damn time. Anyhow, the tunnel didn't have doors, so it was definitely free of such horrors. Ella liked to sit in it and eat her lunch, and sometimes, if no one was around, hum a bit and listen to the echoes. So this is what she did after the spider tutorial, and she was doing it again a few weeks later, when who should appear but Bryn, wielding a most wonderful decorated rain stick. Ella looked up from her sandwich in disbelief and quickly stopped humming. "Oh, hello." Hello. "What's that?" Bryn came over and demonstrated how the rain stick made beautiful rain sounds, which bounced delightfully off the hard concrete walls, so that it sounded as if heavy rain was falling all around them. She let Ella have a go, and their eyes met, sparkling. And then, whoop, 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 whoop! Ella put her hands over her ears. Some sprinklers came on overhead and made good headway into soaking them. Bryn grabbed Ella by the elbow and their 2 backpacks in her other hand. Ella clung on to the rain stick and stumbled out of the tunnel where Bryn led. A fire warden in a yellow hard hat, still wearing a library staff ID badge, frowned at them and pointed crossly over to the grass plaza area. Dripping and smarting with each deafening blare of the fire bell, Ella marched where she was taken. She was somehow separated from Bryn in the crowd, and then it turned out the whole evacuation was just down to some burnt toast. Hours later, when the echoes of the fire bell in her head faded, Ella found she could still imagine the sound of the rain stick and the brush of Bryn's fingertips as she'd handed it to her. With what seemed like an infinite well of patience and goodwill, Ella and Bryn slowly came to know a little of each other's worlds between the rebounding waves of chaos. One day, on a whim, after Bryn had snuck her into the music department to show her a magnificent harp, and had been firmly kicked out again by her lecturer, who was trying to eat in the 5 minutes she had before consultation hour, Ella invited Bryn to come to her sand dune haven. Bryn packed a laptop and a microphone in her bag and agreed keenly, hoping to record a sample of the combined rushing sounds of wind, sea and grass. They squeezed up at the base of one of the dunes, Bryn, unused to the wind, which was very high today, squinting and shaking her head disappointed. The sand will get in the computer, she worried, watching bits blow about amongst the tough grass. Ella watched her pulling a beanie over her ears, and it struck her that Bryn now felt with this one big sound as she did when there were many small sounds competing. Ella turned to her bag and pulled out a large beach towel, which she reached out and wrapped around Bryn like a cloak, shielding her a little from the wind. "Do you think there's such a thing as complete silence?" she asked Bryn, pulling up the hood on her hoodie. "They always say that in books and things, but I've seen complete darkness in a cave once, and another time in the desert, and I've felt complete numbness when I was waking up for an anaesthetic after an operation, and it took me a while to remember what I cared about as well as physically feel. And unlike dogs and cats and things, there's plenty of times when we humans can't smell anything. But I've never listened and heard nothing at all. Never." Bryn thought about it, the towel whipping around her face and fine hairs in her eyebrows shifting slightly in the wind. "You might if I hadn't failed at getting you into the music rooms," she said, somewhat sulkily. "There are soundproof rooms for recording in there." Ella considered. "Yeah, but things inside make sounds. I make sounds. You make sounds." She found herself describing to Bryn the kinds of things she heard, and the things she'd heard that first day while Bryn was waiting for her to say something. Bryn listened with obvious delight, grinning at the bit about the gerbils. "I think that's wonderful," she said eventually, when Ella gave her time to speak. It was so much easier to talk freely here with the rushing of the dunes. "You never miss anything. It's like a superpower." She paused and looked at Ella with a real openness, like she was really seeing her. "But I see what you mean. And I say we make a quest. Together, we'll find a place where there's real silence, even for you, one day." She held out her hand to Ella as if to shake on it, but when Ella took it, she briefly interlaced their fingers and gave Ella's hand a squeeze. Echoes of the sensation stayed with Ella for weeks afterwards. The promised quest, however, proved difficult. As the semester went by, Ella began to find herself annoyed by how often Bryn thought something might count as silence. Crossly, she would point out all the myriad sounds that were present. Yet Bryn never seemed shaken. She would just gracefully accept that she was wrong and promise again to find Ella's silence for her. This routine calmness began to get on Ella's nerves, and she quietly wondered if Bryn was really as cool as she'd thought. At the beginning of second semester, the archaeology lecturer announced that there was to be an optional overnight field trip to study some ruins in the mountains. It sounded perfect to Ella. Lots of wind, peaceful nature-filled places where the mark of humans was wearing away. It sounded spidery to Bryn, but she said she'd go because Ella was going, which frustrated Ella somewhat, but she let it go. Somehow it seemed important. She supposed she should be flattered. The ruins themselves were too windy even for Ella. On the other hand, they did make incredible whistling sounds in the gale that had decided to appear especially for their visit. Bryn tried to record some, cotton wool in her ears and a scarf tied around her head. When everyone had taken notes and Bryn's computer had a lot of noise recorded in it that Ella doubted would work in any kind of music, the group headed back down into the valley below, where most of them boarded a bus and headed back to a hostel nearby. Ella, however, was determined to camp. She picked a great spot, sheltered by a rocky outcrop on two sides, and made a campfire in the pre-dug fire pit, while Bryn proved extremely good with the tent. Ella had spread out her waterproof bag lining as a mat and sat herself by the coals, turning her recently emptied tin hot chocolate mug over and over in her hands, when Bryn, to her great surprise, produced a violin and began to play a soft lullaby-like tune that blended into the landscape with the ease of water. To this day, Ella could never say, and Bryn would never tell, where she'd kept the instrument the rest of the day. Suddenly, a phrase unfinished, as she sat cross-legged next to Ella at the fireside. Bryn stopped, let go of the bow, which fell into her lap, and stretched out an arm to put one long, slender, cool finger to Ella's lips. Ella stopped humming, still as if she'd been momentarily turned to ice. She was aware in a big real-in-the-moment way of the cool of Bryn's chilled skin against her lips. And then, with a shock, she heard the silence. The dusk had turned to dark around them. The crickets had finished singing and the birds were still. The wind had paused to rest between breaths. And Ella supposed that she and Bryn must have both been holding theirs, for there it was. Auditory emptiness. A complete absence of sound. Bryn's eyes met Ella's and gleamed triumphantly. Ella's met hers and gleamed with tears. And little by little, the silence filled up again. The breeze drew breath and shifted the grass. Birds adjusted their sleeping positions. The fire gave a crack. Ella could hear Bryn's breathing, and her own. She could hear her own heartbeat. But this time, she didn't mind at all. Silence existed.
Wow.
Very good.
Yeah, it's very moving.
So, yeah, there was... The Grace one was hard to include. So I ended up going... I went like to the definition of grace and all the different meanings grace can have. And ended up sort of including things about social grace and sort of gracefully admitting you're wrong and things like that. But it was hard to include really effectively. Echoes were easy, and I ended up with echoes within echoes all the way through, which was really nice. I looked up about echoes and I wanted to know if there were any myths about it. And I found out that echo in Greek mythology, I'll just try and find it. I think she's a goddess. There we go. A mountain nymph whose ability to speak was cursed, so she was only able to repeat the last words other people spoke to her.
Oh, lovely.
So I initially was going to have Ella do a lot more of that, but I ended up only managing to kind of put it in the one time when she repeats sound, but I thought that's something that would happen to you if you were sort of hearing all kinds of things. You repeat bits of other things that you're hearing rather than following your thread very well.
And what did you research this thing of like high level awareness of sound? It sounds a bit
not really. It is
Asperger's. Or something,
well, it's similar to what someone with very high sort of auditory sensitivity with an autism spectrum disorder or something might experience without the other sensory overload stuff. Just with it, but some people do have like an auditory processing problem where they can't tune into the relevant thing without hearing all the other things. That's something I know about, but I didn't sort of research that a lot. It actually just occurred to me one night. We were in the place we stayed with the not much of a kitchen.
Yes.
And I was like lying on the floor doing a semi-supine, and it was quiet. And at first I thought, oh, it's quiet. And then I heard there was a clock, and there was sort of from like some hot water or something, and there was sort of movement, and so I thought this thing about, is there really ever complete silence, or can you always hear something if you really listen enough?
That people who do experience complete silence say it's really disconcerting.
Yes.
So, maybe right out in the outback. You can hear it in
a vacuum, because you can't hear your own breathing.
Yeah.
Then, but I think even if you're in space and you've got a spacesuit on, you can
You'd be hearing your breathing,
yourself within the suit, can't you? I guess if you held your breath in the middle of the desert in the outback, you might hear complete silence there.
Yeah, but that thing about subtle wind or just the shifting of grass.
But any movement in the sand or little critters like scorpions scuttle out or something, you can hear that. Yeah.
In the space thing, you can only hear yourself.
You can hear yourself in space.
But nothing else.
But you would hear yourself, because you'd be trapped inside your suit.
You're trapped inside your skull,
I wondered whether inside the spaceship, if you've got like a pressurized area.
If it's pressurised, it's the same. Then you can hear each other.
Then you hear because there's air in the
Yeah.
space that's
Yeah.
kept in there
It's
for
because
you.
space is a void.
And the sound travels through the air, so
Yeah.
yeah, you'd hear silence if you were about to die because you'd
I
been
think
shot
there's a
out into the
science-
vacuum.
Yeah,
A science fiction story that says in space no one can hear you scream.
No,
Mm.
well, it's true, even you.
That's
If
right.
you're actually in space without a suit on, yes.
What about underwater where you're
The sound is muffled, but you can still
No,
hear.
it's a sound that
no
travels
right
better
down?
in water.
Yeah. Some,
Well, it sounds
some
different.
things.
That's why all the whales and things
Whales
use
can go
those
miles.
particular kinds of travelling
That's right.
echolocation sounds.
Mm.
But we can still hear underwater. It just sounds weird and whoa.
But
I know
sound
we
travels a lot
can.
further underwater apparently than it does.
If
Goes
you're
a long
still
way.
underwater though, in some circumstances, you get that enormous sense of peace, don't you?
Yeah.
You know.
Because does it go further but take longer or something like that? Because
I
the
don't know.
water's
Its
thicker than
quality's
the
certainly
air.
different, but you know.
Mm. It is different, but it does travel a long way. You can hear a ship's engine if you're underwater
Yeah.
for a long way, and things like that, or the turning. Like
Well,
I
I
don't know how
remember that.
whales cope with propellers and things going.
That must
above
be
them.
really noisy for
That'd
them.
be
I hate
very
them.
noisy. For
Really
them.
noisy.
They're like a supersonic jet going past.
Yeah,
Yes.
like when we had those fighter planes
Mm.
doing a demo or whatever over the forest, and it was
Yeah.
like complete peace, and then vroom, it was
Yeah.
like an earthquake was coming or
Yeah.
something.
And they're very noisy, those jets.
Mm.
And they don't normally fly at that altitude. Really surprising when that happened.
Mm.
But that's an interesting. The whole topic's quite interesting because we've sort of noticed when we've been walking in very quiet places. They're not silent places, but like forests and so on. Perhaps you can hear, and it might be kilometres away, but distant motorways, that kind
Yeah.
of constant hum. And we can focus on that and find it disruptive,
Annoying,
irritating,
yeah.
whatever.
Or
But
we
you
can
notice that-
focus on the closer sounds,
Yes.
and sort of tune it out because it's constant.
Mm.
And constant sound is a lot easier. There's like lots of people like white noise or the sound
Yeah.
of rain or
Yeah, yeah.
something like that, like when they're trying to sleep, because
See,
then you
yeah.
don't notice the sudden sounds.
That's
even,
right, yeah, I
like,
can get that.
suddenly there's a dog going woof, or
Yeah.
you know.
And that's true of nature too. Like we've noticed how birds quite happy in their forest with the motorway in the distance.
They
It
don't
doesn't seem
care,
to worry
yeah.
them terribly much. Or squirrels or whatever. But a sudden sound they'll startle too. So
Yes.
it must be a common thing, you know.
because you
So,
can't get this sort of
implies
sense
threat.
of the baseline
yeah.
sound,
Mm,
you know, and then that becomes your silence,
mm.
like what
beautiful.
Ella was doing in the dunes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that sound is there, but that's
And
constant,
acceptable.
so
yeah.
it can be, negated. And I don't know if that's real,
It's like
but
your anchor.
I know a lot of people who will tune into white sound or a fan or something like that, and lots of people who panic or some kids with autism and stuff, they have to listen to static or
yeah.
and tune out everything else.
Mm.
Put on the headphones and have white noise and things like that.
Yeah, lots of Asperger's kids use that.
Yeah, you often see them with
They use their
those.
headphones. and-
Or
Well, they
autism,
might just be
kids with
noise
autism.
cancelling sometimes. They're just to reduce how loud everything is
Yeah,
for them.
yeah.
So it's not.
Noisy classrooms, I don't like them.
No, far too much going on.
The description of the growing attachment between the two characters is lovely. I think that's very gently done, especially with that
I
kind
don't do non-subtle romance.
of no.
So sorry, Alice, if you wanted something
No.
more overt, but
It was very
Oh.
nice. I thought that was very
That's it.
beautiful. I quite liked the fact that at one point she got annoyed too.
yeah, well, that's what happens.
what
in
we
real life,
do.
doesn't it? You get a bit annoyed with people.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. Well, this is good, but not that bit.
And you get annoyed with people and they don't understand. So,
We do.
if this other person is going, oh, this is the solution. Is this
Yeah.
the solution? Is this
Yeah.
the solution?
Yeah.
And none of those things would work for you because they just aren't getting it.
No, that's
That's
right.
really annoying.
It is. Yeah.
So, I think Ella
When you
was
think someone gets you.
very
you know.
annoying, yeah,
Yeah,
because
that's
she
right.
wasn't getting it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That was lovely. That
Mm.
little final scene with the who it is.
Yeah.
That's very nice, yeah. And I think that does happen, like those little micro moments of complete silence.
Yeah.
That they're gone so quickly that we miss them.
We
sometimes.
usually miss them. We usually make a sound ourselves in
We
the
do,
silence.
yeah.
Because you actually have to stop and
Well,
hold
some
your
people-
breath and
I mean, it's a real characteristic of our, like, adolescents and stuff, that they can't stand silence.
don't like it. They don't like it. They fill it up. Yeah.
Yeah, fill it up and
Yeah.
music or laughter or something to fill it in. Yeah,
Mhm.
that was lovely.
Yeah. I learnt a bit about echoes.
Yeah, that was interesting.
Actually, echo. And so I needed to know where an echo would really happen. So apparently, the space has to be at least 17 meters, or the distance to the hard surface that reflects the sound back has to be at least 17 meters.
Wow,
Um,
it's quite long.
It's quite long space because we can't perceive an echo that comes back sooner than 1/10 of a second after the original sound.
Good
So
Lord.
there's always reverb in a room, so our voices are bouncing off the windows and coming back, but that is too close. So it comes back. We can't perceive the difference between our sound that we're making and the sound that's bouncing back. But if you have a long space with a hard enough surface to keep the sound sort of intact, then it'll come back and then we can hear it. And also, a real echo is only the first one. A real echo is just, hello, hello.
Yeah.
And then any others, if it's bouncing off multiple surfaces and coming back to you multiple times, that's a reverberance
Oh, okay.
in a space. Which is the same thing that we spend lots of time about
Using
in
with music.
our music.
Mm.
And when they build cathedrals and concert halls and those places, they specifically think about the size and the hardness and all of those things to make the reverberance like the amount we like to hear.
Yeah.
They talked about some that people don't like the acoustics of, and like they're a bit too big or whatever, then you get that slightly uncomfortable amount of reverb.
So a lot of the old churches, some of the churches we've been have been had beautiful reverberance, I'd say, rather than echo. And you wonder to what extent that was deliberate, because they wouldn't have had amplification or whatever, which we use in modern.
But they may have had some understanding of the kinds of spaces where they liked sound.
That's where the sound felt nice, yeah.
Oh, big spaces, they would have got that idea from caves and things.
Yeah, they found caves that they liked. And it was probably a little bit trial and error. Maybe, this little church doesn't sound as good as this medium church, which sounds better.
Yeah, and
than
if
this
you have
enormous
this round
church.
shape at the back,
Yeah, the rounding
semicircle
behind the thing, so
behind
the
the
sound.
altars and stuff,
Yeah, and that's to stop it being like a dead single echo.
Yeah.
Because that way it's got more different places to bounce
And
off.
so you've got that rounded end to the churches, and then usually the priest or celebrant stands centrally, and the choir quite often sings across that space, like they're not. But we went to one in St. Peter's Cathedral, the Tenebrae service, which had the choir right at the back of the cathedral.
Does that sound good?
Singing forward, it was
Like from
amazing.
behind you?
But they have amplification, Barry, but not.
So it wasn't just the space.
No effects. They had amplification because that wasn't even a very big choir.
I thought they were doing a number of clever things there, though.
But they weren't.
I think they were. I think they had speakers in different positions.
Oh, okay.
And they turned different ones on at different times.
It was so good, Barry
might
thought
be.
initially that it was recorded. The singing was so extraordinary. But he thinks that they were changing where the sound came from.
They were doing some adjustment a bit like you would within a track.
Yeah.
Where you say, okay, the guitar's going to like zoom out to either side or whatever, and the sound's going to come like this at you, and then, the vocals down the middle of it.
That's right. And they definitely use different sound for the spoken word and the sung word.
Oh, yeah. You'd have to, because otherwise you
interesting.
get a lot of echo in a big space.
Yeah. Yeah,
The
so that
spoken
was
word.
interesting.
I think
yeah.
they actually worked out in that one. They were doing some. I can't.
They've done it many times.
They've done it, but I think they extinguish the candles, and I
Yeah.
think the sound. They've got some sort of plan to go along with it.
Yeah.
Follows some sort of.
Yeah, I don't know how.
So
Maybe
the
the sound
soundscape
starts
goes
at the
with the
beginning and moves
ceremony.
to the back or something. I don't know.
That's right. It was
Because that's the way the light's going out, is it?
the light.
Or
The
they
lights
go
are put
forward?
out at the front,
Yeah.
so they have all these candles which are gradually extinguished
Yeah.
until there's just one remaining candle.
But
which
they
is
turn
then
off the
walked-
house lights in the church as well
They
gradually.
did. They used all sorts of things to create that atmosphere, but So that's another interesting thing, the light and the sound.
Like
So
putting them together. Or,
putting them together is an interesting.
yeah, and I had my complete silence happen when it went dark. That for me is just because in the dark not very many animals or people
They don't
try
move.
to move around because they can't see, so you have a lot less scuttling
You
and
do.
chirping and carrying
Mm.
on, even if you
But
are
that's a
out.
really interesting thing. If there is sound in the dark, we notice it far more.
Oh, it
So, for example,
carries,
if you've got a
yeah.
dripping tap, you're fine with it during the day, but when
And
you're
then at
lying
night time
asleep,
you're like, oh, that sound.
stop that
Yeah.
tap.
Like Ella is about that door and
Yeah. I thought that was wonderful.
annoying sounds.
Can relate,
Yeah.
There's always some
Annoying
sound.
sounds
We're
are
at a place
awful.
we've been staying in all the time. There's always been something you pick up once everybody's
Something
gone to
that's
sleep.
annoying.
There's a
lots of them had
clock
clocks.
or-
Lots of them
oh,
had clocks.
clocks.
The one where we were when I had a sore tooth had a dreadful clock. It was just like, yeah, you're still awake. You're still awake.
Yeah.
Chuck, chuck, like that loud.
Yeah, no.
In the night.
Awful.
You shouldn't have clocks that loud.
We should have. Was it removable? We should have taken it. And
I
honestly,
don't know where it was. I never
Take it
saw
off
the
the wall
darn
and
thing. I
put
could
it
just
in the
hear it at
corridor.
night time.
Go and put it by the host's bed.
Yeah. Put it outside their door. Here you go.
Yeah.
Too loud. Get rid of it.
Yeah.
I found a few interesting other things. So I sort of went into silence a bit, whether there's sort of mythology or anything about it. And there's far too sort of varied for me to draw on that. But I found this nice little quote thing which says, "Silence is like a sword and a shield because it can be used to seek the truth or hide the truth."
Oh yeah.
And so I had this little note, does silence equal secrets? Which I didn't really draw in, but
No, it's
it's
there
a
for
whole
another
sort of
time.
other branch,
There is,
really.
yeah.
I also learnt about violins.
Yes, you learnt about the
Eastern
ancient.
ancestors of the violin are the Arabian Rabab and Rabec.
Yeah.
And in Europe in the late Middle Ages, they had the fiddle, which wasn't far off. The Chinese eru and morincourt evolved from the rabab. But the current form of the violin appeared suddenly in 1550 and has changed very little since. So
Wow.
they just basically hit on this thing that worked
And
they kept it.
It's something about that sound hole, the kind of F shape.
That
of the
is
sound
the
holes.
one thing that has been improved on in
Yes.
some way. I didn't write it down, but there's something about like the shape of the sound hole or where it is that has changed from the Baroque violins to the
That's
modern
right.
violins. But I can't remember exactly what. But yeah, it's to do with the placement and shape of that hole in it. Yeah.
Do you recall seeing those photographs? I forget who published them, but they had photographs taken from inside instruments. So there was a
they're
photograph
beautiful.
from inside the
Yeah.
violin, sort of looking up at that
You
glorious.
can sort of see all of it and why the
It's
sound
like
travels like it
it's like a
does, yeah.
beautiful building or something. It's
Yeah.
just quite extraordinary. How do people work this out? This is just.
Another thing I didn't end up putting in was worrying about making embarrassing sounds. So it occurred to me, if you're very sensitive to sound, that you can sort of hear things, sounds that you make, or you notice when you go you go to talk and you decide not to, and you sort of go or whatever.
Yeah, or your laugh comes out.
Your
wrong,
laugh
or
sounds weird, or you
you snort and
make snorts, or your tummy's gargling. One of my friends at uni had that problem. Every time we went to like our colloquium where we listened to people talk about their research, she'd always have a grumbly tummy. And it was actually really loud. We could hear her tummy, but she thought it was much louder than it was.
Of course.
Because when it's you think these
Why
things.
is that embarrassing? It's funny, isn't it? It really is.
Well,
Your tummy goes gurgle.
Somebody's
gurgle,
body's doing things over there.
You do. It's
Yeah.
odd. It's odd that we try to cover that up.
Yeah, so everyone's tummy does it. It was just funny because most people would take their lunch in, so.
Yes.
Why
And
was
she
her
did
tummy
not,
grumbly?
or-
I don't know. I think she ate before, or she tried to, or she'd have a snack, or just
Maybe
did
she
it anyway.
needed to.
Tummy just did it anyway.
Some of Beethoven's music is meant to describe his indigestion and his digestive processes.
Yeah.
You know, which we had. Well, it's true.
What, Beethoven's music?
Yeah,
Yeah, there is
and
one
the
that's
gurgling of his
specifically
belly,
about
and
his,
absolutely,
like digestive noises, isn't there?
He had terrible trouble.
Oh.
He probably had,
Wow.
Crohn's disease or
He
whatever.
got
Yeah,
deaf,
bowel or
so it didn't
something.
matter later on. He couldn't
He
hear
couldn't
it
hear.
anymore.
No, but it caused pain and
Yeah, it would have
discomfort
been
as
very
well.
uncomfortable, yeah.
Grumpy old man who wrote beautiful.
He would have been grumpy because he couldn't hear anymore. That's why he would have been
He
grumpy.
was very grumpy about
being
that.
very
He wasn't
grumpy.
very well either.
No.
And he was kind of difficult and a bit, demonstrably,
Not as bad as Haydn.
discernibly bonkers.
Was
Hey,
Haydn grumpier than
Haydn was
Beethoven?
where he would hang people out of windows by their
Oh, he's
feet.
the one who put the singers outside.
No,
Yeah.
Haydn was known to be extremely benign.
No,
Oh.
it
But
wasn't.
he drew the
even-
line.
He hated
He
singers.
drew the line at singers because they
Don't work with singers.
demanded too much. So he did, on occasion,
Lloyd
dangle them out
understands.
of the window to get them to cooperate a bit better.
Yeah. Yeah, the last thing that I sort of had and didn't go into very much is the difference between an awkward silence between two people and a comfortable silence between
That's
two people, and the
fascinating.
progression from awkward silence to comfortable silence was kind of something I wanted to happen between Ella and Bryn, but which it did, but there was more emphasis on the other sounds that were in the silence, so you didn't really
It's
silence. But
interesting,
I was sort of thinking that she should have, whenever there's an awkward silence, she hears the things in it, and that
Yes.
like amplifies the awkwardness
Yeah.
of that.
But the awkwardness is, in your perception of the
It
silence,
is,
isn't
it
it?
is.
It's nothing to do with the silence. So it is an interesting thing, and we've all experienced it.
like, do you think that you should be filling it, or are they waiting for you to say something?
And
or not?
actually, tutorials is a classic time when they're, any time is really, but in tutorials.
What do people
where
think about?
What do people think about? And there's the pause,
Yeah,
and you come on, someone say something.
someone say
And
something.
then you think,
But-
just don't let it be Barry, because he'll say something really, you know how there's always the person who
Yeah.
has to speak first, and it's some
Yeah.
inane kind of thing.
Anyway,
That was a
bye,
good story.
people on recording. Okay,
Oh God, that's a spider coming.
a spider.